Young Spartan crouches in the tall grass, his breathing shallow, his fingers white around the hilt of a dagger. The night air smells of thyme and turned earth. Somewhere in the darkness behind him, a dog barks once and goes quiet. He has been here for hours, motionless, invisible, the way his instructors trained him. Not through encouragement, through years of calibrated pain that burned every instinct toward hesitation out of him, the way you burn infection out of a wound. He isn't waiting for a Persian invader or a rival soldier. He's waiting for a farmer, an unarmed laborer walking home in the moonlight with calloused hands and absolutely no idea that tonight is the last night of his life. This isn't a crime. It is his graduation ceremony. We've all seen the Hollywood version of Sparta, the oiled abs, the red cloaks snapping in the mountain wind, the cries of freedom, and the 300 heroes standing against an ocean of tyranny while the audience cheers and the studio makes a sequel. The mythology is seductive because it gives us something clean. Brave men making a noble sacrifice at the edge of a narrow pass, holding the line for civilization itself. We want it to be that simple. We want the Spartans to be us, the version of us we aspire to be, disciplined, fearless, willing to die for something worth dying for. But in 1964, archaeologists pulled a different story out of a well near ancient Sparta. The bones of dozens of infants mixed with the remains of full-grown adults. Not a burial, not a cemetery, disposal site. The administrative record of a civilization built not on valor, but on the systematic elimination of anyone it couldn't control, couldn't use, and couldn't afford to let live. The well was quiet. It did not advertise itself. In a way, was the most Spartan thing about it. Today, we are stripping away the motivational poster version of history to uncover the Krypteia, the Spartan secret police. You're going to discover why Leonidas didn't just lead warriors. He led the products of a machine designed for internal mass murder. We will explore the unsanitized reality of how a few thousand citizens maintained a kingdom of fear over a population that vastly outnumbered them. By the time we're done, the famous epitaph carved at Thermopylae is going to read very differently to you than it did before. This is the investigation into the 20,000 invisible victims that Hollywood didn't show you. To understand the monster Leonidas became, you have to understand what Sparta sat on top of. In the 8th century BC, the Spartans conquered their neighbors, the Messenians, after a brutal series of wars that lasted generations. They didn't simply defeat them. They didn't absorb them as citizens. They turned them into Helots, state-owned serfs bound to the land they had once called their own, working it now for the benefit of the men who had taken it from them. The Helots farmed the grain, pressed the olives, tended the livestock, and fed every Spartan household from birth to death. A Spartan citizen, a full Spartiate, did not work with his hands, was the bargain. The Helots provided the surplus that freed Spartan men to do nothing from the age of 7 until the day they died except train to kill. Without the Helots, Sparta did not eat. Without the Helots, there was no Agoge, no professional warrior caste, no Thermopylae, no story at all. Every shield, every spear, every famous act of Spartan discipline was built on the labor of an enslaved population with no legal standing and no recognized humanity under Spartan law. This is where the existential problem begins. The Helots outnumbered their masters at a ratio of at least 7 to 1. Some ancient sources place it higher, perhaps 10 to 1 in certain regions. Every single day, the Spartan elite woke up inside a calculation they could never fully solve. They were surrounded, outnumbered, structurally dependent on the very people they had enslaved. They knew, as every masterclass in history has eventually known, that the moment the subjugated population decided it had nothing left to lose, the mathematics of that ratio would become catastrophic. Think about what that ratio means at a human level. Almost every person you encountered in daily life, the person who brought you your food, who harvested your land, who knew every path through your estate, had a reason to want you dead. The entire economy was a house of cards. and every card was held in place by one thing: the certainty that defiance meant immediate and brutal death. How do you maintain that certainty across 200,000 people, across generations, across entire lifetimes of accumulated grievance? You don't build walls. Walls can be climbed. You build something more durable than stone. You build fear. And to build fear that lasts, you have to make it intimate. You have to make every single Helot feel that the darkness itself is watching them. Shafar's friend, Leonidas, was taken from his mother. Not asked, not prepared. Taken, removed in the institutional way that states remove children when they have decided the child belongs to them rather than to the family that produced it. This was the Agoge, a total institution, a closed world with its own calendar, its own language of suffering, and its own idea of what a human being was for. Boys were organized into units called Agali, which translates, with deliberate frankness, as herds. Not squads, not companies, herds. The word choice was not bureaucratic sloppiness. It was a statement about how the state regarded these children. They were livestock to be shaped. The person underneath was, from the beginning, beside the point. They were issued one cloak per year, a single garment, regardless of whether the previous one had been destroyed. No shoes. In a landscape of rocky hillsides and frozen river crossings, they slept on reed mats they cut themselves from the riverbank with bare hands. They were kept in a state of deliberate, chronic hunger, not as punishment for any failure, but as policy. The architects of the Agoge had decided that a boy who was always hungry would become a man who could endure deprivation without complaint. The suffering was not incidental to the training. It was the training. You've likely heard the story of the Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. He stood perfectly still while the animal tore into his abdomen, choosing to die rather than reveal his theft. Spartans told this story with pride as a model of success, but notice what kind of success it is. The boy is not brave in the way we usually mean. He doesn't face an enemy, he doesn't protect anyone. What he does is maintain his composure while being destroyed from the inside. He gives nothing away. He is, in that moment, perfectly opaque, a closed system that produces no readable signal. Capacity for concealment, for total self-masking, was the psychological prerequisite for everything the Krypteia would later ask of these men. By 18, these boys had been publicly whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia in ritual competitions where the objective was to absorb the most punishment before collapsing. Crowds came to watch. The boys who lasted longest were celebrated. The ones who flinched had failed at the one thing the Agoge most required. They had let the inside become visible. They weren't being educated in any sense we would recognize. They were being conditioned to obey commands they hadn't chosen and couldn't question, to kill without hesitation, and to feel no moral disturbance about any of it. The system didn't just want soldiers. It wanted a particular kind of soldier, one so thoroughly reformed by the process that acting against the system's interests had become, at a neurological level, merely impossible to form as a thought. This brings us to the part of Spartan training that Hollywood cleaned up, sanded smooth, and buried under slow-motion cinematography, the Krypteia. Each year, the most capable graduates were selected. They were stripped of everything. No armor, no unit, no supply line. No fellow soldiers to share the moral weight. They were sent alone into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and the skills the Agoge had spent years drilling into them. Their mission: to move through Helot territory under cover of darkness and assassinate any Helot who appeared too strong, too intelligent, too charismatic, or too likely to inspire others to collective action. The target profile was not criminal behavior. It was not evidence of conspiracy. It was potential. The Krypteia didn't hunt troublemakers. It hunted leaders, men who, if given time and opportunity, might become the organizing center of the one thing that kept every Spartan up at night. How did they execute this system without triggering the religious consequences that attached to killing in the ancient world? Every year, the Spartan magistrates, the ephors, formally and publicly declared war on the Helots, not because any rebellion was underway, not in response to any event at all, simply as a recurring institutional act, performed on schedule like a budget cycle or a harvest festival. The declaration transformed the legal category of killing. A Helot murdered in peacetime created religious pollution, miasma, that contaminated the killer and required ritual cleansing. Helot killed during a declared state of war was a combatant. The gods had been notified. The law said so. The annual declaration was a bureaucratic solution to a moral problem that made the nighttime assassination of unarmed farmers a sanctioned act of the Spartan state. In the most precise sense of the phrase, institutionalized murder, not hidden, not shameful, but openly administered, the way you administer a tax or a census. The Krypteia did not punish anyone. It was prevention, the elimination of a precondition rather than a response to a cause. The Spartans had understood something that modern counterinsurgency doctrine would spend centuries slowly rediscovering. You cannot wait for rebellion to organize. By the time a leader has followers, it is already too late to stop them cheaply. The Krypteia removed the precondition for revolt before revolt could become thinkable. If a Helot was strong enough to matter in a fight, he was killed. If a Helot was wise enough to be listened to, he was killed. If a Helot had accumulated any informal authority in his community, any reputation that might make others look to him in a moment of crisis, he was killed. The system was a mirror image of the Agoge. Where the Agoge built capacity in the Spartan class, the Krypteia systematically destroyed it in the Helot class. Two machines, running in opposite directions, maintaining the gap between them. And if you are tempted to think of the Krypteia as a dark coming-of-age ritual that the Spartans eventually outgrew, look at what happened during the Peloponnesian War. When Sparta was at the height of its power, the Spartan state announced that any Helot who had served with distinction in battle alongside Spartan forces would be granted their freedom. 2,000 men stepped forward. 2,000 men who had bled for Sparta, proven their courage under fire, done everything the system asked. They were crowned with wreaths, marched through the sacred precincts of the temples, and publicly celebrated as heroes. Then they vanished, every single one of them. No witnesses, no records, no graves. 2,000 men who had made themselves visible, who had proven in the most legible way possible that they were capable and loyal, were eliminated precisely because they had proven those things. Competence in a subjugated population is not an asset to the people holding the chains. It is the most dangerous thing in the world. This was the machinery of power that Leonidas commanded when he turned his face towards Thermopylae. When Leonidas selected his 300, the story reaches us as a tale of choosing the finest warriors, the most battle-hardened, the best. But look at the actual selection criterion that survives in the ancient sources. He chose men who each had a living son, not men who were past their prime, men who had already produced children currently inside the Agoge, already being processed by the machine, already past the point of no return. The Agoge needed bodies. The Krypteia needed operators. The system of Helots oppression needed its next generation of administrators. Leonidas and his 300 had already completed the most important transaction the state required of them. Their deaths at the pass were not a sacrifice the men chose in any meaningful sense. They were a loss the state had already budgeted for, an acceptable expenditure of men whose replacement was already in development. The heroic sacrifice we celebrate was the system calculating acceptable losses. Leonidas and his men were not fighting for freedom. They were, by any honest definition, the least free men in the Greek world, products of a process that had spent 30 years ensuring they could not think, feel, or act outside the parameters it had installed in them. The Agoge had removed the capacity for genuine choice. The Krypteia had removed the last moral distinction between a soldier and an instrument of institutional terror. They were obedient. The law required them to hold a pass until they died, and so they held it. And they died, and the machine that had made them continued to run. The famous epitaph carved at the pass, the lines attributed to the poet Simonides, has echoed through Western culture for 2.5 millennia. It says, "Go tell the Spartans that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Read it again. It does not mention freedom. It does not mention heroism. It does not mention Greece, or the defense of civilization, or the glory of dying for something larger than yourself. It mentions obedience. The men who commissioned that inscription chose that word deliberately, in a civilization that understood the weight of language better than almost any other in the ancient world. Obedient, not brave, not free, not even proud. Obedient. Read against the history we have just traced. The epitaph is not a celebration carved by men who died for something they believed in. It is a confession, a statement of what the system had made of them, written in the language the system itself would have chosen. Sparta eventually collapsed, not because the Spartans lost their courage, and not because a foreign army finally overwhelmed their defenses. It collapsed because the economic foundation beneath the entire structure was removed. When the Theban general Epaminondas liberated the Messenians in 371 BC, he didn't just win a battle. He dismantled the engine. The Helots were free. The surplus that fed the warriors, funded the Agoge, and sustained the Krypteia simply ceased to flow. Without the labor of an enslaved population maintaining the material base of Spartan military life, the military class had nothing to stand on. The machine ran out of fuel. Without fuel, even the most perfectly engineered machine is just metal in a field. The history we think we know is often just a mask, a clean and presentable face pressed over something far darker. Sparta's mask was well-fitted. Courage, discipline, sacrifice, the glory of dying for something larger than yourself. These are not false values, but in Sparta's case, they were in service of a machine whose core purpose was terror, the management of a subjugated population through the systematic elimination of its most capable members, conducted by children who had themselves been stripped of everything except the capacity to comply. The 300 at Thermopylae were real. Their deaths were real, but the kingdom behind them, the one they were dying to preserve, was soaked in the blood of the 20,000 invisible people that Hollywood chose not to show you. If this investigative deep dive into the Spartan secret police gave you a new perspective on the 300, hit the subscribe button. I'll see you in the next investigation.